Well, welcome into the first Whole Hog pregame show. I am Seth Campbell. That's Matt Jones beside me, and we're going to give you a little breakdown on the Arkansas versus Mississippi State game here for the next 15 minutes or so. And we brought in Matt to talk a little bit about the Mississippi State Bulldogs because he writes the scouting reports for the Hogs Illustrated that is out this week, and he knows a little bit about the Bulldogs after some deep research.
Well, I mean, I don't think I knew as much about them as I thought I did after week one. I thought they would really struggle at LSU. And maybe not struggle is the right word, but I just thought with there not being a spring practice and with the preseason being as out of whack as it's been, that it might take, 3 or 4 weeks for Mike Leach to get this offense not even rolling along. I mean, I thought it might be a year or two before you saw them start putting up the types of numbers that they put in Baton Rouge last week. And so that was the real surprise of week one to me, is that they were able to just produce as well as they did, as quickly as they did. I thought it would be a little while before the air raid would. I think it can be successful in the SEC. It has been. Mike Leach was the offensive coordinator at Kentucky when Hal Mumme was their head coach and Tim Couch was breaking all the passing records. I just thought it would take a little bit longer for them to really get going this season. That was a great performance in week one.
It really was. KJ Costello, I almost called him Perry Costello because umpire, that's definitely the wrong thing. KJ Costello, 623 yards is definitely impressive. And this was a game that you kind of circled before the season started as a possibility for Arkansas to break their SEC winning streak. Yeah. But it only took 1 week instead of maybe 1 year for that air raid offense to take off in Mississippi.
Well, I thought Arkansas had a chance to win this game, and I think they still could win it if things, if the ball bounces the right way for them in Starkville. I just thought with the fact that both of them had first-year head coaches, the fact that it's Mike Leach's first game in Starkville, there's probably a little bit of pressure, nerves that go into that. I thought they might have a chance to go down to Starkville and win that game, and because I thought, and really I think what influenced my thoughts on that before the season the most, Seth, was the fact that Dan Mullen and Joe Moorhead for the last 10-plus years in Starkville have run these run first, almost kind of like option-based or maybe quarterback run schemes that are so different than what Leach runs with the air raid. And so I thought that there would be that transition period to where maybe their offense wasn't going. They've lost some players defensively, even though they've recruited real well on that side of the ball. I just thought maybe it's a chance for Arkansas to go in there and get a win in week 2. And again, I think it might happen. I think Mississippi State will win. But they looked a lot better against LSU than I think anybody, even your most ardent Mississippi State fan, I can't imagine would have figured they would go into Baton Rouge and looked as good as they did.
Well, after looking at that game one and doing some research on Mississippi State, give us a scouting report on what to watch out for the Bulldogs.
Well, I mean, KJ Costello is where it starts, and the passing game. They threw it 60 times against LSU, of course, 623 yards, 5 touchdowns. What was interesting to me was that they were still able to win despite turning the ball over 4 times. Costello threw 2 interceptions. He lost a fumble. They lost another fumble. And I thought that, you turn it over that many times against a team that's as good as LSU, you're probably not going to win the game very many times, especially on the road. And I know, home field advantage is much different this year, and we'll talk a little bit about that being in Starkville here in just a second. But, you're on the road, and you're probably not going to win very many times. You turn it over 4 times against the number 6 team in the country or whatever LSU was. So Costello, I thought he played a really nice game. I thought he showed his seniority, if you will, having that veteran leadership about him. He played at Stanford, and he had some pretty good, had a really good 2018 season at Stanford. Last year battled some injuries there. So that's what you look at first offensively. Kylan Hill, really good running back, and we'll talk about him a little bit more. They're not using him as much in the running game this year as they did a year ago. You think about when he came here to Fayetteville last year, he ran for almost 200 yards in the first half. He had runs of 62, 58, and 37 yards before halftime. But he was their best receiver last week against LSU, and I think that was really maybe the difference. Mississippi State has got an inexperienced receiving core. They've got a lot of receivers. They took all their tight ends and converted them to receivers when Leach came. They've got 26 receivers on the roster, but outside of Osiris Mitchell, they don't have just a lot of experience in the receiving core. It was Kylan Hill catching 8 passes for 158 yards and a touchdown, 75-yard touchdown against LSU, that I thought was really the difference in the game, that they were able to, incorporate him into the passing game. I'll be interested to watch this week whether or not they use him maybe more as a traditional running back, given the success that he had against the Razorbacks last year. And then, finally, I don't think you can. I think it gets overlooked because of the passing, the passing numbers that Mississippi State's put up. They've got a pretty good offensive line. They've got a big offensive line. And you think about the teams in the SEC who, when you think about line play, you think about Auburn, you think about Alabama, you think about Georgia, and you think about LSU. But really the two teams that I think get overlooked the most are Kentucky and Mississippi State. And Mississippi State has been really good on the line for the last few years. Think about defensively, guys like Jeffrey Simmons or Montez Sweat. Offensively, they've had some pretty good linemen come through there. And they've got a good offensive line this year. They went out and hit the transfer portal, solidified their offensive line. They got their starting center came over from LSU. They went and they got a right tackle from Alabama. And so then they've added in too a left tackle who redshirted last year named Charles Cross. And Charles Cross was a 5-star offensive lineman coming out of high school. And so there's a big-time offensive line that I think Mississippi State has, and I think it's got the potential to be overlooked a little bit because of those big numbers that they put in the passing game.
All right, Matt. So that's a good breakdown of Mississippi State Bulldogs. Going back to their first game at home under Leach with the pressure, is there a little bit of added pressure there? And then also the fact that there isn't any fans in the stands, does that make it a little different? Yeah,
so I mean, it's 75% fewer people, 75% fewer cowbells, and that's a big deal in Starkville. If you've ever been to a game there, I think my head is still ringing from the last time I went down to Starkville. It's such a you have to be there to understand just how loud it can get in Starkville at a football game. It's one of the most underrated environments, I think, in all of college football. And the cowbells make such a big difference. But I think that there's some pressure there for Mississippi State. You went from getting 6 votes in the AP poll last week to now you're the number 16 team in the country. It's Mike Leach's first home game. There's going to be that expectation maybe to replicate, if not perform better than they did against LSU. And then there's the obvious, there's the obvious pitfall of overlooking Arkansas, because Arkansas has lost 20 straight SEC games. They've lost 25 of their last 26. I mean, you think back to 2016, the night that Raleigh Williams had the big game down in Starkville, Arkansas has won 1 SEC game since then. And so it was also in the state of Mississippi. That state is where their last 2 SEC wins have been, against Mississippi State and against Ole Miss. And so, I think that, do I think Mississippi State will slip up? I think it's probably not very likely, but I certainly think they could, just because, man, you beat a team like LSU, it's really easy to come back the next week and overlook whoever you're playing. And, you think about on Twitter this week, Mississippi State put the, come get on our bandwagon video.
Right.
I feel like it's a little early to be making proclamations like that. And so you just kind of wonder where their mind is at and whether or not they're really ready for Arkansas. And you got to believe Arkansas is really hungry for this game, given the way they played against Georgia. And I didn't think they played all that bad. I thought defensively they played pretty well, but the way they played against Georgia, and they really want to get this losing streak over with. And so we'll see if they can do it Saturday. Again, I don't think they're going to, but I think it'll be a closer game than they had week 1, and I think that they've got a much better chance to beat Mississippi State than they had to beat Georgia. And if I'm looking at the totality of Arkansas' schedule based on all things being equal, players not being out for COVID or injuries or something like that, I think Mississippi State's one of the most winnable games they have on their schedule this year.
Looking at the scouting report as you broke it down earlier, give us a player to watch out for on offense and a player to watch out for on defense for Mississippi State.
Well, I think offensively it's Kylan Hill. We talked about, he is kind of the glue of their offense. Last year, he was their leading rusher. Ironically, he's their second leading receiver coming back this season behind Osiris Mitchell, and it kind of shows more the lack of productivity they had at that position last year than maybe just a spectacular year that Kylan Hill had. He had less than 200 receiving yards last year. He almost had more receiving yards in the LSU game than he had all of last year with the Bulldogs. And so, but what they like to do a lot of check downs, receivers coming across the middle, maybe Hill coming out of the backfield. And so if Arkansas can take that away, then I like their opportunity to at least be in the game in the fourth quarter. I think if you can take away that opportunity, and if they can, maybe take away some of those go routes that Mississippi State loves to run, or Mike Leach loves to run in the air raid, then I think they've got an opportunity. And then defensively, it's Errol Thompson. Thompson's a senior linebacker. Coming into this year, he had 227 tackles. He was the only SEC player with more than 200 tackles in his career entering the 2020 season. And so he's kind of like Hill on the offense. He's kind of the glue of the defense. I think he's kind of like Dejon Harris for Arkansas last year, the player that they're going to try to build that defense around. It's a 3-3-5 scheme that they run. They've got a 34-year-old defensive coordinator named Zach Arnett. And Arnett, the last 2 years, has been coordinating at San Diego State, doing a really nice job out there in the Mountain West Conference. It's a little bit different dynamic, obviously, being in the SEC. But what they do a good job of is taking the run away. At San Diego State last year, they had both the lowest number of rushing yards per game and also the lowest rushing yard average. In other words, they allowed less than 3 yards per attempt. And so, I think Thompson's going to be really good in the run game. What I'm interested to see is if Arkansas can maybe exploit that Mississippi State secondary. They've recruited really well along the defensive line. When you think about I mentioned a minute ago, they had Jeffrey Simmons, Montez Sweat. They went and they recruited off of the success that they had, and so they've got some really good defensive linemen. I don't know that they're as good in the secondary, and so I'm going to be interested to see if Arkansas, if they can get past that front seven, maybe, or that front six, because they run a 3-3-5, what kind of success can they have? So it's a tough matchup for Arkansas this week. I think every matchup in the SEC is a tough one for them, at least this year, and. But Errol Thompson is a really good defensive player for the Bulldogs.
All right, good stuff there, Matt. And then to wrap it up here on the pregame show, what do you think about the score prediction? What do you got?
Well, I've gone kind of back and forth on this. Part of me thinks that Mississippi State might have a big offensive showing, given that it's the first game at home for Leach. He's going to want to put on a show for the fans. There's no doubt about it. But I think Arkansas played really well defensively against Georgia. I thought that was a 3-touchdown defense against Georgia. They gave up there was the pick six interception return for a touchdown. There was the block punt that set up another short field for a touchdown. I thought they played really well defensively against Georgia. I saw where I think it was the fewest yards per play Arkansas's defense has given up since the 2015 game at LSU. And so it was a good defensive showing. It wasn't a great defensive showing. I'm interested to see how that translates now against Mississippi State, which is an entirely different offense, or a mostly different offense than what Georgia ran. Todd Monken is out of that air raid coaching tree, but I don't think that was really the air raid that we saw when Georgia came into Fayetteville last week. At least, it wasn't anywhere near what they're going to see in Starkville. All of that is to say, I think Arkansas loses this game. I picked 37-21 in our magazine this week. I'll stick with that. I think it's going to be a better performance for Arkansas's offense. I think it'll be a similar performance for the defense, at least in points scored. Maybe Mississippi State gives up a little bit more, or Arkansas gives up a little bit more offensive yards to Mississippi State. What I'm interested to see, can Arkansas take away maybe the run game if Mississippi State tries to establish that? And then if they can, what does Arkansas do when Mississippi State, they're going to throw the ball all over the place? The key for Arkansas, you can't get behind early to a team like Mississippi State because I think Arkansas's got to be able to run the ball offensively and set up their passing plays off that. And if you get behind early in this game and you've just got to start throwing it all over the field, I don't know that Arkansas is going to be able to have any success.
I think you're exactly right. You got to be able to show that you can stop Mississippi State, but also control the running game and get your weapons like Rakeem Boyd the ball on the ground. All right, well, that's good stuff there from Matt Jones. Thanks so much for joining us today, Matt. We'll be right back, and we'll have Scottie Bordelon from WholeHog Sports on with us next. Well, now we're joined at the desk by Scottie Bordelon, WholeHogSports.com writer. Scottie, let's talk a little bit about Arkansas. Matt gave us a lowdown on the Mississippi State team. Arkansas, they had some positives and some negatives from that Georgia game. We'll start with, maybe some of the positives. What did you see from the Arkansas defense? They really got you excited moving forward into this Mississippi State game.
Yeah, I think for the most part, Arkansas ran to the football pretty well. I think you saw an example of that with Bumper Pool. Maybe when Arkansas's defensive backs were tied up with receivers, Bumper Pool, Grant Morgan were able to make some plays there, maybe get into the head of a young quarterback and maybe throw him off his game a little bit. Defensively, I thought Arkansas kind of set the tone, like with that bumper pool hit, getting off the field on third down. They really held Georgia down on third down really, really well until the second half. And that was really, I thought, pretty encouraging. I thought the defensive game plan, whatever it was for Barry Odom, it worked out really well. Just the depth obviously wasn't there in the second half, and Georgia was able to take advantage of Arkansas. But on the offensive side, it was Traylon Burks. Like Kendall Briles made a concerted effort to get the ball to what I think he's Arkansas's best playmaker by far, and was able to get him the ball in space and create yards after catch. And his touchdown catch, I think he caught around the 20 or 25 yard line and was able to get past a really good defensive back. I think he's a Richard LeCounte, an all-SEC caliber cornerback. So, and then Traylon Burks was just able to make some plays after the catch, which was encouraging. You're glad that Kendall Briles wanted to get him the ball as often as he did.
Yeah.
So it's kind of hit or miss with Felipe Franks in week one, but when you're facing a really good defense, I think that's probably going to happen. There's some first game nerves too.
What do you want to see from the defense? I mean, a lot of publicity's been on the Mississippi State side of the ball, and I mean that's fair when you have your quarterback throw for 623 yards. Like, okay, we understand that, but what does the Arkansas defense have to do? You said it on the WholeHog podcast. You're not really going to stop KJ Costello in the air raid,
right.
But what do you have to do to slow him down?
Yeah, I think you got to be really fundamentally sound defensively, in terms of tackling in space. I think a guy like Jerry Jacobs is going to be matched up on probably Mississippi State's second best receiver, and then Monteric Brown's probably going to be matched up on their top guy on the perimeter. But it's going to be up to guys like Joe Fouché, who played a little bit in the first week, but probably going to be more game ready in week two. Miles Mason missed in week one; he didn't play in week one, and then I think you're counting on guys like Miles Slusher to come in and maybe play a little bit of a role this weekend too. Like, you're going to have speed on the field to account for all of Mississippi State's skill players. So I think just tackling in open space and not getting caught up in the picks and the rubs and the mesh that Mississippi State's going to run. They like to run drag routes. I think that was their most targeted route, according to one analytics site that I was looking at. So Arkansas is going to have, the communication on defense is going to have to be there for sure.
Yeah.
Just so, maybe Bumper Pool he believes that he's covering a guy, or he's matched up on a receiver who's maybe coming across the middle of the field, but maybe Greg Brooks thinks that he's also got that area of the field. The communication is going to have to be sound. And I think Arkansas is also going to have to, maybe apply a little bit of pressure on KJ Costello. I think in week one, he was 5 out of 12 passing against pressure. He threw 7 inaccurate balls and 4 uncatchable passes, 2 interceptable passes. So I think there's going to be some opportunities for Arkansas's defense to maybe come away with some turnovers, particularly some interceptions.
So you got to force Mississippi State into making some of those mistakes, or else they're going to kind of run away with it, is what it seems like.
Yeah, for sure. I think Julius Coates is a guy who he's very physically imposing, I think, on Arkansas's defensive line, and he got a lot of praise in the preseason. He didn't make really that much of an impact in week one against Georgia, but Georgia's offensive line is, arguably one of the best in the country. And I remember on Zamir White's touchdown run, I think late in the second half, Julius Coates just kind of really whiffed on a tackle inside the 10. And so I kind of want to see if he can make a little bit of an impact this week. He's going back to, like Matt said on the podcast, he's going back to Mississippi where he played junior college ball. So it's probably going to be I don't know if you call it emotional, but he's kind of going back to a place that he's somewhat familiar. So kind of looking for a big week from him.
And then on the other side of the ball, Felipe Franks is he struggled really in the first game. Yeah. He showed glimpses, and he also showed what it's like to have a guy with experience and SEC experience out there as he was directing traffic, which we did talk about a little bit of, you don't want him to be out there directing traffic. But besides the fact of him having to align everybody before the play, how do you get Felipe Franks going?
Yeah, I think you just allow him more time to survey the field. And in week one, like we've talked on and on and on about how good Georgia's defensive front is. And they they kind of bullied Arkansas's offensive line around. Like, you've got a couple guys on Arkansas's offensive line with Brady Latham and Bo Limmer, redshirt freshman, and then Noah Gatlin. He's in his first game back after a year off from an ACL injury. And so that's 3 of your 5 linemen right there who, maybe a little bit rusty and a little bit inexperienced, I would say. So they didn't, obviously, with Georgia's defensive line being so good, wasn't just a ton of time for Felipe to stand back there and feel comfortable enough in the pocket to deliver some really good throws. He did have his moments, certainly, but I think it just comes down to protection. And Mississippi State's front line, their defensive line got after LSU quite a bit in week 1 too, so that's going to be an interesting matchup. Well, I expect Felipe Franks to look a lot better in week 2 than week 1. I want to see if the passes at or behind the line of scrimmage stays the same, or if, I think there were 10 of his 19 completions in week 1 were not beyond the line of scrimmage. So I want to see maybe if Arkansas makes a little bit more of an effort to, I don't know, if go away from the swing passes and the screen game, just go to it a little bit less frequently and maybe target guys like, Trey Knox and Mike Woods, Traylon Burks, kind of in that intermediate range, maybe 10 to 15 yards downfield.
Well, kind of like you mentioned, Scottie, in that answer, a big key to getting Felipe going will be the offensive line and giving him time. What improvements do you want to see from that offensive line in week 2?
Yeah, just Felipe just needs more time to survey the field. I think that's pretty much it. You also want to see if Arkansas can kind of make some strides in the running game. Against Georgia, anytime Rakeem Boyd touched the ball, there was just a huge mass of bodies, maybe a yard or 2 down the field, but more often it was like at the line of scrimmage, maybe a couple of yards behind the line of scrimmage. Arkansas was just not able to generate hardly any push at all in the running game. And not saying that Mississippi State's defensive front is going to be a pushover, but I think Arkansas will be able to perhaps find a little bit more success in the running game. And if that happens, obviously that's a plus for the passing game too, because you're going to have to account for Rakeem Boyd, and then play action becomes such a big weapon. And you've got a guy in Traylon Burks, so I think he's probably the favorite target of Felipe Franks right now, especially downfield as a downfield threat. So that could possibly open up some deep shots in the passing game too.
All right, Scottie, good stuff there. Really appreciate you coming on. Before we let you go, we got to ask you, who are your players to watch on Arkansas? 1 on defense, 1 on offense for this game against Mississippi State.
Yeah, that's a good question. I think defensively, like I said, I think I want to keep an eye on Julius Coates just to see if he can get some pressure on KJ Costello. I think if Arkansas can kind of knock him off his spot and make him a little bit uncomfortable. I think last week, in week 1, he showed that, he may have had a great game, but he's not immune to create or having turnover type plays. Like, he fumbled the ball. He can be kind of loose with the football in his hands. I know Mike Leach talked about that a little bit this week. He wants him to, when he's moving around in the pocket, keep both hands on the ball, keep it secured. And then, in the secondary, maybe a guy like Jerry Jacobs or Monteric Brown. I think there's going to be some opportunities for those guys to pick off some passes this week. As good as KJ Costello was in the first game, like, his interceptable pass rate was still pretty high. Mm-hmm. And then he also threw some picks too. So it wasn't like he had a perfect game. He threw for a bunch of yards, but it wasn't a perfect game. Maybe on the offensive side of the ball, watching for Rakeem Boyd, he seems to really get going on the ground in the month of October. But this is a little bit different this year, obviously, with the season starting later. And right. So he doesn't kind of have doesn't have the month, maybe 5 weeks to kind of get going on the ground. But I think this is the time of the year when Rakeem Boyd really gets going.
All right, good stuff there, Scottie. Score prediction for this game?
Yeah, I'm going to go with Mississippi State 38, Arkansas 27. I think Arkansas is going to have a pretty good plan defensively. I don't know that KJ Costello is obviously going to throw for 600 yards again. We may never see that again, but I think he's probably going to throw in the 350 to 400 yard range, several touchdowns, and I'm going to be looking to see what Arkansas does to defend Kylan Hill. He can be, like last year, Arkansas knew he was a real problem running the ball out of the backfield, but he showed against LSU that he's a real threat in the passing game too. So they'll have to account for him and a bunch of Mississippi State playmakers that almost had 400 yards after the catch last week, which is really impressive. So I just don't think Arkansas's offense right now is going to be able to keep up with a Mississippi State offense.
Good stuff. I'm going to agree with you in the fact that Mississippi State wins. My score prediction will be 38-28 in favor of the Bulldogs, the second straight Bulldogs that the Razorbacks have played in the SEC. All right, well, Scottie, again, thanks for joining us. And for Scottie and Matt Jones, I am Seth Campbell saying thank you for joining us here on the WholeHog pregame show. And we will see you back here next week.